What makes an addicting roguelike? As an indie dev working on my own roguelike, I think about this question constantly. And 4 months ago, I posted on my Discord server looking for players to privately test my game. I'd been working on a prototype for months, and I wanted to verify if my game had what it took to be a great roguelike. I got a lot of responses, and as a result, I was able to assemble the most elite cohort of playtesters the world has ever seen, composed of players that had played just about every roguelike under the sun, and some that had never played a roguelike in their entire life.
What I'm about to propose to you is both highly lucrative and highly dangerous.
I formed the private server, I sent the game out, and they hated it. But I've been spending the last 4 months chipping away, little by little, pushing weekly updates to my dream team of playtesters, and slowly but surely, I have started to make something that is turning out kind of amazing. And what I've learned is, a few key things make up the difference between addicting roguelikes and annoying roguelikes. And I'm gonna try to cover as many of them as I can in this video. Oh, and by the way, today I'm making the playtest open to the public, and you can request access right now via Steam. Okay, so the first major problem that the playtest group pointed out to me was a problem with engine building. Engine building is a term that came from the board game community, and to explain what it is, I'll use the definition posted by a random person on Reddit 5 years ago. In an engine builder, there are generally two classes of actions. 1, actions that move you closer to victory, and 2, actions that don't directly move you closer, but make your actions of the first type stronger. This definition isn't fully complete for reasons I'll get into soon, but for now, I say we just take the definition and run with it. So if we use Slay the Spire as an example, a type 1 action would be like a combat encounter, and a type 2 action would be the shop, or the parts where you're selecting a new card to add to your deck. This is the engine building part. Something like this is in most roguelikes, including mine, but for some reason, mine sucked. So at the most basic level, my game is a blackjack game, which basically means your goal is to get closer to 21 than the dealer. When you win a hand, you earn chips, and to progress through the game, you need to continuously earn more and more chips at basically an exponentially increasing rate, kind of like Balatro. And an important detail is that you're playing multiple hands at once, and you can kind of mix and match them by sacrificing bad hands in order to bolster your good hands. This is what makes it an actual strategy game and not just gambling. Blackout Jack basically has 3 ways to engine build. You've got boons, which you can think of as jokers in Balatro or relics in Slay the Spire, card effects, which are permanent enchantments that you can add to your cards to give them special boosts, and elixirs, which are limited use items that you can use to temporarily give you a boost or advantage. At face value, this seems like all the components needed for engine building. So what gives? Why did my engine building suck? Let me answer that with a question. Why is engine building called engine building? You know, as opposed to like Upgrade Fest or something like that. Well, in the imaginary Upgrade Fest genre, you might unlock a sword that does 10 damage. But in the engine builder, particularly the good ones, you're never given such a sword. Instead, you're given a bunch of engine parts, and you have to design the engine that produces 10 damage as the output. In other words, in an engine builder, it's how the player designed their engine that determines their power and output in the game. So that begs the question, how do we do that? With early playtests, I started to notice something very quickly. Every round always boiled down to the same thing. Just get 21s. Do whatever I can to get as many 21s as I can. It never got any different or any deeper. Any boon you got basically just made it so you got more chips when you got a 21, but it didn't change the way that you played. So I sat down and basically enumerated all the different actions you could take in my game. Like for example, doubling down, hitting, splitting, standing with 2 cards, winning with a 16, making the dealer bust, building a hand of only diamonds. Basically any sort of outcome that you could make happen on purpose in the game, I wrote it down. Then for each thing on my list, I thought of 2 or 3 different items that you could get that would give you an advantage if you did that thing. So for example, maybe the action is busting, which busting on purpose doesn't seem like a very smart thing to do, but what if there was a boon where if you bust, the adjacent hands get a boost, and another that gave you +1 multiplier every time you bust? And then what if there was a card effect where you gain a stack every time a hand with this card in it busts? So while the base strategy of the game might be to always go for 21s and try not to bust, now if you have one of these items, your strategy might revolve around busting as much as you can. And that is the key to this way of doing things. By creating items for different actions, I basically create created new viable strategies for the game besides just going for 21s. Maybe your goal is to win with as low of a value as possible. Maybe your goal is to have a huge income of life tokens so you can sacrifice like crazy and build stacks on your cards. Maybe it's to build a huge streak on a particular seat, or sabotage the dealer, or build a huge stash so you can play flexibly. Suddenly, there were dozens of different viable strategies that felt way different, and this greatly improved how the game played. So in this example above, I actually touched upon another important aspect of engine building, which is synergies. What I found when I started enumerating items for each action was that I had just designed a bunch of items that synergize well with each other. And if there's one thing that I know from playing a lot of roguelikes, is that there is nothing better than a good synergy. In fact, it's synergy that I believe is what makes a build feel like a build. Let me back up and explain. What I found with these early playtests was that there was never any situational decision making required when entering the shop and deciding which item to get next. Players basically quickly discovered which items were always the best and which ones were always terrible. And the game basically just quickly became a task of figuring out the best items and grabbing them when you came across them, which gets boring really quickly. You need to be able to visit the shop and think, last run this item was great, but this run it's not useful for me. This run it'd be better for me to get this. And the best way to create this dynamic is with items that synergize with each other. With a great engine builder, there's no singular OP item that you should always get in every situation. The only way to achieve OP builds is to find the right synergies. So at this point, one other cool thing was starting to happen with respect to synergies in my game. I'm going to put all these items in a pool I will call designed synergies, but what I began to notice was players were discovering new and interesting ways to make items synergize that I didn't even think of. For example, one playtester discovered that you could use Wild Split to split any hand in two, then use Blood Offering to sacrifice the split hand in exchange for life tokens, and then use Soul Tap to get mana in exchange for sacrificing, thus restoring their mana so they could do this whole sequence over again, essentially creating a perpetual motion machine that could provide infinite life tokens. I did have to end up tweaking these items a little bit because it was a strategy that basically broke the entire game, but it's a great example of how when creating a variety of items suited for a variety of different strategies, hidden, undesigned synergies can emerge. Okay, so now things were better. We had a situation where you could create a build that at least motivated a particular strategy. All right, awesome. Engine building complete. Okay, so there's clearly still more to do to get the engine building where it needs to be. And that brings me to my next topic, which is build upgrade moments, or bums. Basically, a bum is any time where you have one of these type 2 decisions to make that we talked about earlier. And the second key insight I got about my game was that it didn't have enough bums. If you look at a game like Balatro, you have a bum after every round. If you look at a game like Slay the Spire, you have like 40 bums. By comparison, I looked at my game, and over the course of an entire run, you only had 10 bums. Basically, every time you could visit the shop in between a milestone. And what this resulted in was that even though you could technically build a build that was technically unique, it still didn't feel like it was your build. It didn't feel like a build that was being built up brick by brick. The key insight here is that I feel the important thing about roguelikes is that the player feels like a build is theirs. Like it was their strategy that they put together with their own brain. And the only way to achieve this is with plenty of bums. This way, the player has enough time to enact the strategy that they have in their head, or adapt if the strategy that they originally thought out is getting ruined by bad RNG or something like that. In other words, one bad bum doesn't ruin a run. So I knew I didn't have enough bums in the game, so I looked into adding a whole bunch more. The main change I made in this respect was that I added bums in between each round of the game with this dice rolling mechanic. Essentially, every round, instead of playing blackjack, you can choose to spend your life tokens to roll dice for more upgrades. It's basically 3x to the amount of bums in the game, because now each milestone you're probably going to choose to roll the dice 1 or 2 times at least, maybe even 3 times if you're crazy. The other thing I did was I made the shop available between rounds, not just at the end of the milestone. This made it so if you came into some money intra-milestone for whatever reason, you could visit the shop anytime you want. And this leads me to my next extremely important bum-related insight, which is the importance of variable amounts of bums. In the game FTL, an important insight that you'll make after playing for a while is that you should visit as many locations as you can in the first area, thus maximizing the amount of bums that you get before you get to the next area. Bums oftentimes just means more raw upgrades for your build, but I also think of bums like shots on goal in soccer. Like you can't always guarantee that an item that you need is going to show up in the shop, but if your strategy involves getting as many bums as you can, then you're going to get more trips to the shop and increase your odds of getting that item that you need. So the TLDR is basically that a variable amount of bums in the game adds another layer of depth and strategy to basically any roguelike. So like I said before, I originally had exactly 10 bums in the game, no matter what, but how did I make bums variable? Well, like I said, I made the shop visitable anytime, so if you're getting money within the milestone, which does require a specific strategy, then you could visit the shop anytime you want. I also added the ability to re-roll the shop in exchange for money, which is a classic way to add variable bums. In the last, but possibly most revolutionary way that I added variable bums to my game was back with this dice rolling mechanic. Because every round you have to decide if you're going to play blackjack, which moves you closer to beating the milestone, or roll the dice, which is basically another bum. Rolling the dice is risky because not only does it cost life tokens, but you only have so many rounds to beat the milestone, and so every single time you roll the dice, you're giving yourself less rounds to beat the milestone. But rolling the dice as much as you can is a good strategy so your build is strong enough to get you through late game. It's basically an exact reimagination of the system I talked about in FTL earlier, where in FTL, visiting extra planets that don't get you to the next area is kind of like rolling the dice. With each planet that you visit, the bad guys are getting closer and closer to catching up to you, and you're risking not having enough resources to get you to the next area. But it serves you to take this risk so your build is stronger for the next part of the game. Okay, so with all these additions, I estimate I probably 5x the amount of bums in the game, and the effect is extremely noticeable. Builds felt more deliberate, more personalized, more of your own design, and like I was just talking about, I think it adds an extra layer of strategy and depth. And because of this, when endgame comes around and a build starts to take its final form, as the player, I feel like I did this and I'm the genius that made this happen. And this leads me to the next point.
I am not in danger. I am the danger. I am the one who knocks.
This scene from Breaking Bad has become somewhat of a meme in recent years, but I think it's actually touching upon an important phenomenon that every one of us is faced with: locus of control. If you've never heard this term before, essentially locus of control is the degree to which people believe they, as opposed to external forces beyond their influence, have control over the outcome of events in their lives. The concept of locus of control can be split into two subcategories. External locus of control, where people have a predominant sense that outside influences control their outcomes in life, and internal locus of control, where people feel like they are primary movers in their outcomes, and that they have control over how their life turns out, which is what Walt is feeling emphatically in this scene. Now, if you've seen this scene in Breaking Bad, you know that Walt is being a little cuckoo and delusional in this scene, and we all know that in real life there are things we can control and things you can't. All of us can't just be the one who knocks all the time, but in a video game, you can. And I believe roguelikes are uniquely suited to give us this feeling. And I want to be very clear about the nuance here. The feeling is not simply, I'm the ultimate badass. Lots of games give us this fantasy. The fantasy specific to roguelikes is the, I'm the ultimate badass because I've earned it with my skill and preparation, and all that I've worked for is now paying off. And now, I am the one who knocks. I'm sure there are lots of games that give you this feeling, but I'm not sure if any of them do it quite as well as the best roguelikes do. And I think the reason for this is because the player feels like they are the strategic genius that made this badass moment happen. So how can we design roguelikes to give a player a stronger sense of an internal locus of control? I believe one way is with choice maxing. My wife is a speech therapist that works with a lot of kids, and she uses this strategy all the time, though it probably has a different name. This is what I call it though. Essentially, if she wants a kid to practice a particular sound, instead of saying something like, how about we practice our T's? She'll instead frame things like a choice. Something like, do you want to practice your R's, or would you rather practice your T's? Almost without fail, the child she's working with picks one and happily does the exercises. Now, I'm not a child psychologist, I'm not a speech therapist, and I have no research to back this up, but I'd argue this works because the child she's working with feels like they are doing the exercises because they willed it, not the therapist. And I'd argue that whatever this psychological effect is, it works on adults too. And basically, choice maxing your game is an easy way to make players feel this feeling more effectively. So I basically audited a lot of the actions in my game and figured out how I could reframe them to be more choicey. For example, there was a round upgrade which applied a card effect to one random card. I modified it to instead show you 5 random cards and you choose the card that the effect gets applied to. There was a similar thing with seat upgrades, where seat upgrades used to just apply to a random seat, but I made it so you picked the seat that you wanted to apply the upgrade to. Little things like this may seem like small changes, and they are, but I feel like they make a big difference in getting the player to feel that internal locus of control. Now, the big problem with all these choices, and honestly the core issue with all roguelike games, is that inevitably they have to be able to make the wrong choice sometimes. And the core property of roguelikes is that when you lose, you start all the way over. And that brings me to the next part of this video, which is, how do we make starting all the way over not suck? Let me start this topic with a counter example. I just got Nier Automata for the Steam Summer Sale, and I died fighting these little dudes. And god damn it, I almost crashed out when I discovered that I literally had to start the entire thing all the way over, and the game didn't save any of my progress of the last 30 or 40 minutes. Now, before you get mad at me in the comments, yes, I know that there's a reason for this. Please don't spoil the game for me. I have recovered from this crash out, and I am enjoying the game. But I'm bringing this up to make a point, which is that starting over in roguelikes doesn't feel as bad because of the promise that every time you start back over, the game is going to be different enough this time around that even though I'm technically starting over, this next run still feels new and interesting to play. The inverse of this is where bad roguelikes go wrong. If there is a slog of sameness that a player has to get through to get to the point they were at before in a roguelike, then it's just not going to be replayable and fun or just a good roguelike at all. And what I found is preventing this slog of sameness is actually really hard to do, and the reason for that is because of this chart. I've talked about this chart a lot on this channel, showing that typically you want a game to get harder as the game goes on, and then you've got this fun channel here, which is basically showing a game that is progressively getting more difficult, but remaining in the fun channel, not too hard where it's frustrating, but also not so easy that it's boring. Roguelikes seemingly have an impossible challenge with regard to this fun channel. Say you're a player that just got to the second half of the game. You're all the way in this part of the fun channel, and then you die, and you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Now look where you are. You're in the boring zone. I believe a roguelike absolutely must handle this issue if it has any chance of being playable beyond just one run. And if we look at it from a theoretical perspective, it basically means bending this fun channel so it looks like this, which is a hilariously difficult sounding thing to do. But it's possible, and every great roguelike does it. And the way I see it, the only way that it's possible is with these two properties. One, progressing out of early game should be pretty easy. Otherwise, new players would just have a ridiculously frustrating experience. And two, the goal of the expert player early game should be to build their engine as much as possible before things get hard. To use FTL as an example again, getting through that first sector is not very hard, even for a beginner player. But getting through the first sector while visiting as many encounters as you possibly can, while trying to get through it as unscathed as possible, is hard. Slay the Spire also has a dynamic like this, where you can optionally fight these elite battles, which give you better items for your build. The elite battles are probably something that a first-time player would avoid, but seasoned players that know what they're doing can go after. The key property of both of these games is that early game isn't just a slog that you have to get through to get to late game. Early game is a fundamental aspect of your run that you must do well at if you want to have a chance at late game. I added this dynamic to Blackout Jack by adding two types of round bonuses when you win: early bonuses and overshoot bonuses. Essentially, if you meet the milestone quota with rounds to spare, you get a cash bonus. And if you way overshoot the milestone quota, you get another cash bonus, incentivizing you not to just scrape by early, but to build the best hands you can right out of the gate. Also, if you're better at the game, then you need less rounds to meet the milestone quota, and so you can use more of your rounds to roll the dice more and get more bums. This is just another reason why variable amounts of bums is critical to a good roguelike. It's funny because these seem like ridiculously simple changes and are literally directly ripped from Clover Pit and Balatro. It's always interesting to have a moment that's like, oh, that's why they do it like this. And I feel like this is one of those moments. Okay, so I feel like I addressed the difficulty curve issue. But there's another thing that great roguelikes do to keep starting all the way over from feeling like crap, and that's variety from the very beginning. Earlier I talked about how roguelikes are able to pull off this starting all the way over thing because the randomness makes everything feel different with each run. But the problem is that even with randomness, if you're always starting from the exact same starting point, the very beginning is always going to feel exactly the same. Almost all great roguelikes that I've seen get around this problem with starting classes, and that's exactly what I added to Blackout Jack. Basically, as the game progresses, you start to unlock a series of new classes that you can start with, and each class corresponds to a completely different playstyle. You've got the default class, which increases your draw rate into your stash, the dog class, which reduces the cost of sacrificing, and you've got the cut purse build, which increases the amount of dice that you get when you roll dice. Each of these things fundamentally changing how you go about the game, and more importantly, immediately giving you a new strategy and playstyle for your next run. And with that, I think we pretty much have solved the issue with starting all the way over, and making it not suck, but be a new opportunity to experiment with new things and see the game from a different lens. Now, throughout this entire video, I've used the term RNG a lot, in other words, randomness, and I've talked about how it's fundamental to every single roguelike. The downside of randomness is that it inevitably leads to something incredibly annoying happening.
Alright.
Like you setting up the perfect high-scoring hand poised to get 1 billion points, only for the dealer to turn a 21 and you end up with nothing. This kind of thing happens from time to time in roguelikes, and it sucks. So as designers, we have a dilemma. We need risk and randomness to keep the game from being boring and tedious as we replay it over and over, but when the random bad thing happens, it feels terrible. I'm not gonna lie, this one is a tough one, especially for blackjack. Sometimes players can just get completely shafted. I do have a couple things that I've implemented to try to mitigate this issue though. The first is to give the player lots of opportunities to prevent bad thing from happening, at a cost. For example, throughout the game, you'll have lots of opportunities to get items and cards that make the dealer both less likely to get a 21 and more likely to bust. So if the player ever does get into a situation where the dealer got a 21, more likely than not, it's because they chose not to get an item that would have prevented that. For dice rolls, the player can choose to spend more life tokens to get more dice. So if they get a bad roll, it's not just an issue of bad RNG, but the player chose not to buy in with more dice. Yes, maybe you got a bad roll, but you could have put in 1 more life token and that maybe would have been enough to get a higher roll. This goes back to that speech therapy trick I was talking about earlier. We're trying to build that internal locus of control, so when bad things do happen to the player, external bad things, the player feels like they are the ones that caused that thing to happen, not the game. The other thing I do to help mitigate the effects of bad RNG is essentially trying to give the player the opportunity to adapt when they get bad luck. One example of this is when the dealer gets a natural blackjack, which is basically when the dealer's first 2 cards equal a 21. If this happens, the dealer immediately turns his cards up so you can see, hey man, you're playing against a 21. This prevents scenarios like the one I was talking about above, where you spend 10 minutes perfectly formulating the $1 million hand, only to get your dreams crushed by the dealer turning a natural blackjack. By showing the player the dealer's 21 before they get to act, the player can now figure out a plan. Maybe they have an elixir they can use to sabotage the dealer in some way. Maybe they have a boon that helps them if they tie with the dealer. Or maybe they're still screwed in this scenario and they can use this round to sacrifice hands and farm powerful cards for next round. I think what this all really boils down to is to always try to give control back to the player when possible, when anything happens in the game, both good and bad. This has both psychological effects, but it also just has real strategic impact and makes the game deeper and more interesting in turn. I do still think there is more to do with this dealer getting 21 issue. For example, the dealer can still completely screw you over by turning a 21 on the 3rd card and beyond, and there's no warning for this in any way, and there's no way to adapt. I currently don't have any ideas for this, but let me know in the comments if you have any. Okay, and that is everything I have done in the last few months to turn my roguelike from one that was honestly pretty annoying to play to one that I think is pretty freaking awesome now. But I will let you be the judge of that, because the open playtest for Blackout Jack is officially open, and you can play it now on Steam right now. I'll leave the link to that in the description, and you can let me know. Have I been cooking, or does it still need more time in the oven? Let me know in the Discord. Link to that in the description as well. Alright, that's all for the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Bye-bye.